Before we begin, understand this isn't just a tale of betrayal, or war, or kingship. It's a story of love turned into a weapon, and how desire, when exposed to the harsh light of power, can be punished in ways no human should ever endure. If you're drawn to the buried truths and unspoken horrors of history, subscribe to Dark Hours Archive. Here, we don't rewrite history, we unbury it. Let us begin. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger. A nobleman, yes, but more than that, a man whose fate was tied to a king's heart, and ultimately, to a nation's rage. The year was 1322. England groaned under the weight of civil unrest. Its people starved, its barons rebelled, but in the royal court, one man thrived. Hugh. He wasn't a war hero, he wasn't beloved by the people. What he had was access to the crown, to the throne, to Edward II himself. Sound quiet footsteps echoing on marble floors. The creak of a heavy door. It began as loyalty, service, friendship, but soon it twisted into something more. The king, still grieving the brutal murder of his first companion, Piers Gaveston, found in Hugh something familiar: charm, intelligence, a kind of elegance that clashed with the brutality of medieval politics. And Hugh, he played the part, whispered counsel in Edward's ear, stoked the flames of isolation, and in time, became the king's favorite. But in this world, favorite meant something more, not just affection, not just proximity. It meant power earned, unchecked, and unspeakably dangerous. Hugh began seizing lands from the nobility, not through war, but through law, twisting royal decrees to claim what wasn't his. He ruined families, imprisoned rivals, silenced opposition, all with Edward's blessing. The court changed. Where once sat proud lords and wise advisors, now stood men too afraid to speak, because Hugh's gaze was everywhere, and Edward's favor meant immunity. Soundscape: a falcon cries in the distance, wind picks up, dust swirling like memory. But there was one person who saw through the facade, one person who refused to play the game. Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella, daughter of France, unyielding, observant, cold as frost when crossed. At first she played along, she endured the humiliation, watched as her husband gave Hugh everything: titles, lands, even military command. She waited, listened, learned, and when the moment was right, she struck. In 1325, Isabella left for France under the pretext of diplomacy, but she had no intention of returning alone. In Paris, she found Roger Mortimer, an exiled baron with hatred burning behind his eyes. Together, they planned the unmaking of a king, not just Edward, but Hugh as well. Because everyone knew Edward without Hugh was vulnerable, but Hugh without Edward was nothing. Sound oars splashing in cold water, the ship's ropes tightening in the wind. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a modest force. To their surprise, they were greeted not with resistance, but with cheers. Nobles joined them, peasants supported them, even priests prayed for their success. Edward and Hugh were forced to flee, disguised, panicked, dragged from one hiding place to the next. But England was no longer theirs, and the net was closing. They were captured in South Wales, dragged through streets, mocked, beaten. No longer king and favorite, just traitors in robes. Soundscape shifts: drums, crowd jeering, fire crackling faintly. Hugh was put on trial, if it could even be called that. No jury, no defense, only accusations read aloud as crowds howled for blood. He was charged with theft, treason, and sodomy. The last charge was whispered, but everyone knew what it meant. They weren't just punishing a political manipulator. They were punishing a lover, a man who dared to lie in the king's bed. The verdict was predetermined. The sentence, far worse than death. Because for Hugh Despenser the Younger, they didn't just want to kill him, they wanted to erase him. And so they prepared an execution that would echo through centuries. Music halts. Silence. Then, slowly, the dull rhythm of a heartbeat resumes. It wouldn't happen in secret, it would be public. A lesson for all, a warning carved into flesh. They dragged Hugh through the streets of Hereford, naked, covered in filth. Crowds spat, threw rocks, screamed obscenities. They tied him to a ladder, not upright but face down. Sound the clinking of blades, slow and deliberate, and then, they castrated him while still alive. Not quickly, not mercifully, with dull knives, rusted tools. He screamed so loud the crowd fell silent, and as his genitals were thrown into a fire before his eyes, he wept, not for death, but for what came next, because it was not over. They sliced open his abdomen, pulled out his entrails one by one, burned them slowly, still alive, still screaming, until finally they tore out his heart. Only then did the executioner raise the axe and cut off his head. The body was quartered, limbs nailed to the gates of English cities. The head displayed in London, a man who had once ruled the court, reduced to ash, bone, and whispers. Soundscape fades to cold wind. A church bell tolls once, then silence. The silence after his death was louder than the crowd that had roared for his mutilation. His body had been carved into a lesson, scattered across England like a warning written in blood, and yet something lingered, not guilt, not grief, but a cold, calculated satisfaction from those who had orchestrated his fall. Queen Isabella, once humiliated by the sight of her husband's favorite parading power before her very throne, now stood triumphant. Roger Mortimer, the exiled baron turned kingmaker, had demonstrated exactly what happens to those who dare love a king too boldly, too openly, too dangerously. But Hugh's destruction wasn't just personal revenge, it was political theater, designed to crush dissent and reshape the narrative of Edward's reign into a cautionary tale. They didn't just end Hugh Despenser's life, they burned his name into the soil as a symbol of royal corruption, of unnatural affection, of power gained through passion rather than bloodline or war. And Edward, the once proud king who had showered Hugh with titles, lands, and unchecked influence, he was no longer a monarch, he was a shadow, a prisoner, a man made hollow by the violent removal of the one person who had truly mattered to him. Dragged from castle to castle, Edward was a king in name only. His commands were ignored, his supporters were scattered, his crown, heavy with disgrace, had become a relic, something others wielded in his name while he sat in chains. Staring at cold stone walls, Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents, speaking for his young son, Edward III, who had been crowned while his father still breathed. But everyone knew who held the true power, and yet, that power was fragile, because secrets have weight, and rumors, especially those soaked in blood, never stay buried for long. The people remembered the spectacle, they remembered the execution, they remembered the screams, but they also remembered what led to it: the favoritism, the sudden rise of a man they never elected, the quiet intimacy between king and companion that had shifted the axis of royal politics. And as weeks turned to months, a question began to whisper through the court, through the taverns, through the cloisters of the monasteries. Was Edward truly gone, or had the Queen merely taken everything from him except his heartbeat? Official records claimed he died a prisoner, quietly, in the depths of Berkeley Castle. But the story that spread darker, crueler, soaked in whispered horror, told of a death far more graphic. The tale that survives isn't one of poison or quiet strangulation. No, it's of a method reserved not for kings but for traitors, for abominations, for those who needed to be unmade from the inside out. A red-hot poker, forced into his body while he was still breathing, a death that left no external wounds, no scars to show the crime. A message, hidden in torture: love the wrong man, and you will burn for it. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered, because the story was believed. And belief, in the medieval world, was more powerful than truth. It shaped memory, it guided fear, it dictated how future kings would behave, how close they could let others stand beside their throne. It created a boundary between affection and destruction, between loyalty and death, and at its center, forever embedded in the black heart of English history, was Hugh Despenser, the favorite, the lover, the man whose rise rewrote the rules and whose fall rewrote them again in flame and ash. But what did it mean to be a favorite in those times? It meant power, yes, but it also meant exposure. It meant your life was tied not to your blood, but to the whims of one man. And that man, however regal, however devoted, could not protect you when the world turned against you. Edward's affection had given Hugh the world, but it had also painted a target across his back. And when the blades came for him, they did not just aim to kill. They aimed to punish, to humiliate, to reduce him to something less than human. His execution was not just about removing a threat, it was about purging a presence, making an example, cleansing the court of the man who had, for a brief time, made the king human. And that, perhaps, was his real crime. Not treason, not theft, but that he made Edward feel that he stood beside the king not as a servant, not as a soldier, but as a companion, that he saw the man beneath the crown and loved him for it. That kind of intimacy, in a time of cold strategy and arranged unions, was dangerous. It could inspire loyalty that bypassed the church, the law, even the crown itself. It threatened the order, the chain of power. And when power feels threatened, it responds not with words but with fire. Edward's silence after Hugh's death was telling. He made no speeches, he gave no resistance, he simply faded, as if the light inside him had been extinguished the moment Hugh's was. The two were linked in history, in politics, in love, and finally, in destruction. One torn apart by mobs, the other left to rot in isolation, both transformed into myths, cautionary tales that echoed in the halls of future kings, who learned from their downfall not what love meant but what it cost. This was the legacy left behind. A nation that had watched a man be unmade in public, and another erased in private. And in between them, a silence so thick it still stretches across the centuries. Not a silence of peace but of warning. Edward may have worn the crown, but it was Hugh's blood that stained it, and that stain never washed away. The death of Hugh Despenser had not only broken Edward, it had exposed a new truth about England's monarchy. Affection was dangerous, and love, if directed in the wrong place, was a crime punishable by fire, steel, and spectacle. The public had cheered as Hugh was torn apart, yet what lingered wasn't celebration, it was unease. They had seen a man dismembered for love, for proximity, for favor, and deep inside they knew that what happened to him could happen again to anyone who stood too close to power. As winter fell over England, the throne no longer shimmered with gold. It pulsed with fear. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer had claimed the reins, guiding the kingdom through their young son's name, but the shadow of their cruelty grew heavier by the day. They had destroyed the king's favorite, silenced the king himself, and ruled with cold precision. But even those who held the blade are not immune to its edge. Edward II, imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, had become a ghost. His days were filled with damp stone, rotting straw, and the echoes of footsteps he couldn't trust. His meals were sparse, his guards silent, and the worst part was the silence in his own mind, because, without Hugh, he was not a ruler, he was not a man, he was something waiting to be forgotten. Rumors swirled that he spoke to shadows, that he stared at the fire for hours, unmoving, seeing in the flames not warmth but memory. The memory of a face twisted in agony, of a scream buried in the roar of a crowd, of hands that once held his own now burned to ash. And then, he too disappeared. The official story claimed illness, a fever, natural causes, but no one believed that. Not after what had been done to Despenser. The alternate story, the one that slipped between the stones of monasteries and the parchment of whispered letters, was far more grotesque. It claimed Edward was killed quietly, yes, but not mercifully. That a red-hot poker had been used to penetrate him from behind, scorching his insides while leaving no visible wound. The same punishment inflicted upon his lover, now applied to the king himself, as if to make them one in death as they had been in life. There were no witnesses, no trial, just the legend of a fire, and a scream that never stopped echoing inside the walls of that castle. But even that horror couldn't contain the rot within the new regime. Isabella and Mortimer ruled with increasing paranoia. Every whisper felt like a dagger, every courtier's glance a possible betrayal. They had removed Edward and Despenser, but they could not remove the memory of what they had done. Guilt, after all, is its own kind of poison, and it seeped into the cracks of the court, into the corridors of castles, into the mind of a boy Edward III who watched, listened, and waited. At just 17 he had seen his father imprisoned, his mother transformed into a tyrant, and his kingdom turned into something cold and unnatural. And then he struck. In 1330, in a swift, calculated coup, Edward III seized control. Mortimer was arrested and sentenced to death, not in secret, not quietly, but publicly hanged at Tyburn as crowds gathered to witness the fall of the man who had ruled from the shadows. There was no torture, no spectacle, just a rope and gravity. Perhaps even Edward III knew the line between justice and vengeance had already been crossed too many times. As for Isabella, she was spared execution but exiled from power. She lived the rest of her life in quiet seclusion, wrapped in wealth but never again in control. Some say she wandered her estate at night, talking to ghosts. Others claimed she had gone mad, but one thing was certain, she never ruled again. And she never spoke of Hugh Despenser, not once, as if by not naming him, she could erase what had been done. But history has a long memory. The death of Hugh Despenser, and the horror inflicted on Edward II, became more than royal tragedy. It became a legend, a lesson, a scar. The English monarchy would never again allow such intimacy between king and favorite to rise unchecked. Future monarchs kept their affections buried deep beneath protocol and ceremony. And still, the story of Despenser survived passed in hushed tones through generations of historians, playwrights, and chroniclers, not because they pitied him, but because what was done to him revealed the brutal mechanics of power, how it seduces, exposes, and then destroys. In the centuries that followed, Despenser's name appeared in plays, in sermons, in the margins of history books, always connected to one emotion: fear, not fear of him, but fear of becoming him, of being too close to the throne, of being loved too much by someone the world demanded be untouchable. His death wasn't just a political act, it was a myth-making ritual, one designed to show that in the eyes of empire, love was weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. But perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't the castration, or the public disembowelment, or even the burning. It was the knowledge that the man who held the king's heart was reduced to a symbol, to an example, to a warning etched in fire. He had once been a noble, a counselor, a partner, and in the end, he became a legend soaked in blood. A reminder that in royal courts, affection is not protection, it is peril. And now, centuries later, we still speak his name, Hugh Despenser. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man who dared to be seen, and paid the price with his body. The body of Hugh Despenser was long gone, reduced to ash, scattered across city gates, rotted into the wind, but his presence never fully vanished. In the years following his execution, his name haunted England's conscience like a ghost no prayer could dispel. In dark corridors of power, his fate was invoked not out of justice, but fear of being too close, too favored, too essential to the wrong person. For what Despenser represented was something far more dangerous than treason. He represented intimacy in the cold machinery of empire, a softness in a world that demanded steel, and that was a crime none would forgive. As Edward III settled into his rule, England shifted, stability returned, order was restored, and the court once again wore its mask of dignity and tradition. But deep beneath the polished veneer, there lingered a quiet dread, a shared understanding that what had happened to Despenser, and to his king, could happen again. Every noble who whispered into a monarch's ear did so with the memory of a man tied to a ladder and cut open while still screaming. Every advisor who stood too close to power remembered the fire, the crowd, the mutilation performed not just as punishment, but as message. Be careful whom you love. Be careful what you become when a king trusts you. Even the clergy, who once denounced Hugh's sins, grew uneasy in their silence. Many had blessed his execution. Others watched from behind the safety of scripture. But as the years passed, they began to wonder whether their complicity had cursed them too. Sermons shifted. Penance was whispered in darker tones. And across monasteries, the tale of Despenser became more than history, it became an omen. A reminder that even the most sacred institutions could become tools of vengeance, when fear ruled the altar. The chronicles of the time, eager to cleanse the image of Edward III, softened their records. Despenser's crimes were exaggerated, his character vilified, his proximity to the king reduced to manipulation rather than affection. They scrubbed away what made the story truly terrifying, not the political overreach, not the corruption, but the vulnerability, the emotional thread between two men, torn apart by a world that could not, or would not, understand it. But despite their efforts, the truth clung to the margins, in obscure records, in foreign accounts, encoded phrases and symbolic metaphors. The people remembered, maybe not clearly, maybe not fully, but they remembered that something had been taken too far, that power had once devoured love, and called it justice. In time, plays were written, retellings emerged, and the image of Hugh Despenser became blurred, part historical figure, part tragic character, part embodiment of what happens when passion enters the palace. He was no longer just a man who died. He was the question the monarchy never wanted to answer. What happens when kings stop pretending? When they see more in a companion than just a servant, when they feel, centuries passed, England changed, thrones rose and fell, but the echo of Despenser's fate remained embedded in the monarchy's DNA. Even those who never spoke his name lived in the shadow of his story, and in every royal scandal, in every favorite turned outcast, in every exile and mysterious downfall, there were traces of him, the man who climbed too high, loved too deeply, and was punished with a death designed not to kill but to erase. And yet, he wasn't erased. He endured, not in monuments or memorials, but in our knees, in the way historians hesitated to write the full truth, in the way textbooks glossed over his end, in the way artists painted the court of Edward II with a quiet tension that never seemed to lift. It wasn't just about Hugh, it was about what Hugh revealed about kingship, about love, about the fine line between loyalty and possession. Even in death he was watching, from the towers of castles, from the pages of chronicles, from the edges of sermons and poems and songs sung in hushed voices when candles burned low. He was a warning to some, a martyr to others, a riddle to those who dared to question the official version. And always, there was the fire, the one they said consumed him, the one they said consumed the king, and the one that still flickered behind the eyes of anyone who got too close to royal favor. Despenser's body may have been scattered, but his story refused to die, because stories born in agony, born in screams, born in flamedows are the ones that cling to history like scars. You don't erase them, you carry them. And so the monarchy, whether it admitted it or not, carried Hugh, carried Edward, carried the silence, the shame, the unspoken grief. Every coronation that followed was conducted under that silent weight. Every court ritual laced with the memory of what happens when a king's love becomes visible, when the line between ruler and man is blurred by desire. And perhaps that is the true horror, not the execution, not the mutilation, but the fact that even now, hundreds of years later, the fear remains, the fear of being known. The fear of being remembered, not for your crimes, but for your connection, for having mattered to someone powerful in a way the world was not ready to accept. The story of Hugh Despenser and Edward II is not just one of death. It's a story of punishment designed to make affection look monstrous, to transform tenderness into treason, to take a man who was once a heartbeat away from a crown and reduce him to a cautionary tale whispered through time. And what endures centuries later is not just the memory of torture or the grotesque spectacle of a man's body carved up in public, yet the realization that this happened not because of war, not because of crime, but because of closeness. Because one man loved a king too much. Because a king could not bear to let him go, and the world responded with blades and fire. What makes Hugh's end even more horrific is that he was not a singular case. History is littered with names of favorites destroyed for the crime of proximity, those who were too visible, too influential, too trusted by monarchs who dared show emotion. But Hugh's death was different because of its theatrical brutality. It was not meant to kill him swiftly. It was meant to humiliate, to unmake, to erase identity itself. And that makes it more than history. It makes it a message carved into the DNA of power itself. Centuries have passed, yet the echoes remain. In royal families that hide behind protocol, in leaders too afraid to show weakness, in societies that still punish difference with silence or spectacle. The instruments of torture have changed, but the fear has not. What happened to Hugh Despenser wasn't just a moment of medieval cruelty. It was a cultural decision to make an example out of intimacy, and that decision never truly went away. When we speak his name today, we don't do so to honor his life. We do it to confront what was done to him, to recognize that power often destroys what it cannot control. That history, when stripped of its gold and banners, is soaked in blood and built on the backs of those who got too close to the fire. Despenser's story, for all its horror, is a mirror, one that reflects the darkest corners of monarchy, of loyalty, of love. And maybe that's why it still matters. Because even now, in an age of digital crowns and democratic illusions, the same patterns endure. People rise too quickly. They're favored, they're envied, then they fall. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in flames, and sometimes, like Hugh Despenser, they are destroyed not for what they did, but for who they were to someone powerful. There is no statue of Hugh Despenser, no shrine, no grave adorned with flowers, but there is this story. There is this memory, and there is the lesson that those in power may never say aloud, but always remember, that the heart, when tied to a throne, becomes a target. And so we close this tale not with resolution, but with reckoning. Because in the dark archive of history, there are stories we inherit not just as facts, but as warnings. Warnings about what happens when love dares to rise above station, when one man becomes too necessary to another, when favor becomes fate, and when fate is met with fire. If you made it this far, you read not just Curious You, read someone who refuses to look away from history's darkest corners. You understand that truth isn't always clean, that sometimes, the stories that matter most are the ones wrapped in blood, in shame, in silence. So if you're ready to go deeper into the unspoken, the forgotten, the forbidden, then join us. Subscribe to Dark Hours Archive. Every week we bring you new stories, the textbooks buried, real history, raw, unsettling, unforgettable. And we don't flinch, because someone has to remember. Someone has to speak for the voices extinguished in flame. And someone has to ask, what if it happens again? Comment below. Share your thoughts. Tell us who else you want us to unbury. Because the dead don't stay silent forever. They wait beneath stone, beneath lies, beneath comfort. And here, in the archive, we listen.